Yeah, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of uh, Cover Crop and Soil Health Week. Um, my name is David Karki. I'm an extension agronomy field specialist based out of Watertown, and we have one speaker today, which will be an hour long or so presentation will be. And if you just logged on and weren't able to listen to the video, a couple of housekeeping things. On your screen, you will see Q&A and chat features on the bottom of your screen, which you can use anytime during the presentation and ask questions. And after the presentation is done, about an hour later, we will ask you a couple of questions. There will be a poll on your screen. Ask a couple of questions about your opinion on today's presentation, and after that, I will show you the QR code for CE units credits for your crop advisor certification. And to do that, you need to have a crop advisor app to get that certification and scan that QR code at the end of the presentation today. And today's speaker, we have Dr. Dwayne Beck, and I think we all know him very well, and some of us know him very well. And he's the manager at our Dakota Lakes Research Farm located near Pierre. And after his PhD in 1983, he took another position as a SDSU research farm manager at the James Valley Research Center in Redfield, South Dakota, and then he was there for about 7 years. And since 1990, he's managing Dakota Lakes Research Farm. And he has spoken at numerous national and international meetings and is renowned for not only for his research work but also for his teaching, and his research usually focuses on no-till cover crop rotation, cover crop, soil conservation, and everything that has to deal with conservation agriculture and managing ecosystem in a better and natural way. And I personally, and we would also as an SDSU group would like to thank you for everything that you've done over the years and help make that change that's needed out there in common people's lives. And without further ado, I would let its floor is yours, Dwayne. And if I missed anything, you can add on to that introduction part. And today's presentation title is it's very interesting: striving to do the right thing versus doing the wrong thing better. Welcome, Dwayne, and we're glad to have you here today.
Dwayne, you might still be muted.
I knew I'd get something wrong. Thanks, David. The rumors of my resignation or my retirement are a bit premature. We're still looking for a replacement, which has been a bit of a challenge. So the title today is a little different. I'm not being judgmental in terms of what we're doing, but it might be a man thing. When we get to going someplace, sometimes we don't really evaluate where we're going so much, or ask for directions, or evaluate those kind of things. We just keep blundering along. So striving to do the right thing versus doing the wrong thing better is a topic for today. See if this went off by mistake. Okay, do it this way. Okay, let's try something different here. They seem to be frozen for some reason. There we go. This is DakotaLakesResearch.com, or DakotaLakes.com is our website. We had a virtual field day this year, and there's the link. If you send me an email at dwayne.beck@sdstate.edu, I can send that link to you as well. It's actually quite good. It talks a lot about the rotational things that we're not going to necessarily talk about today very much. and then a lot about our phosphorus studies and those kind of things. Dakota Lakes Research Farm is located on the shores of the Missouri River. We have both irrigated and dry land operations. We now graze that pasture to the west or the left side. We don't own that, but we do grazing on that as we integrate cattle into the farmland part. We also have some land to the north that's very heavy West River clay soils that got lost and they're on the wrong side of the river. So we have all of those. The terrain here is a rolling mixed grass prairie. And you can see kind of this is a dry land field. The only place we have trees is in major drainage ways. I'm going to get philosophical today and take a look back at where we are in terms of the US and Dakota Lakes and whatever. I think we have a farming system now that's very heavily focused on mass production of commodities that go somewhere else for processing, or they go overseas. And transportation is a big part of what we do, both on farm and after we've harvested. So it's a change, and I'm not sure that we've evaluated that well. So the forces that led to where we are right now probably started when man first started to farm, and the basis of some of this stuff is a book by Darren Qualman called Civilization Critical. He's gone back and done the real research work on it. I've been saying these things for a while, and when I ran into his book, it just reinforced what I was thinking. Early farming systems were often polycultures in this hemisphere, and when they ran into negative feedback loops and the land degraded, they just moved on. In Africa, the slash and mulch type farming, not the burning until the Europeans got there, was that way. So civilization would rise and then they would fall because of land degradation. When civilization became even less mobile, where cities were involved, this increased the demand on the land, more degradation. Always the energy was a limiting factor because all energy was biological and came directly from the sun. So products produced by the sunlight were used as food, feed, and fuel. Using too much land for feed, for instance, for animal traction, reduced food supplies or fuel quantities. There was always a balancing act. The Western Hemisphere had few animals suited for use in tillage and transportation until Europeans arrived. This impacted their farming systems because you couldn't transport things very far. They were relatively successful especially along the rivers where they could move things. One of the interesting sidelights of reading Lewis and Clark's journals is they stopped in Bismarck and bought corn from the Native Americans who were farming on those islands on the river. Progress as we know it today was limited because there was not enough energy to both produce the food and transport it elsewhere for sale. So they really couldn't do a lot of export type things. There was not enough food and feed to build cities and fight wars. So empires like the Roman, Spanish, British, Inca, and Aztec began to expand their territory and use slaves to increase food production. And that is a relevant factor in the United States as well at one time. Ruth and I were in France 5 years ago now. We did about 3 weeks driving around France in a car that had an English-speaking GPS. So that was an interesting trip. And we would do meetings in the mornings and we would drive to the next city. And when we got to the next city, they'd always take us to see their castle. And I would always ask them, okay, you got this wonderful castle here that took a huge amount of resources to build. At the time it was being built, where did you get the food and those kind of energy things that you needed? And they would say, well, in the land around the castle, and consistently the land around the castle was the most degraded in the area, and it really wouldn't produce food anymore. And even the land further away from the castle was incredibly degraded. And this is what they call good farmland. And on the flat, it looks like this. They are now plowing on the hillsides, trying to get a little more organic matter out of those hillsides because the bottoms are pretty well worn out. So the response to that in the 1400s and on, was global exploration, and then of course exploitation by Europeans, and it was driven by the need to find more land to degrade. In South Dakota, this took the form of the LaVeandre brothers, who came, were French fur trading, sons of a French fur trader in Winnipeg in the Red River Colony. They came west across Manitoba and what's now North Dakota, across the Continental Divide from the Red River drainage into the Missouri River drainage, and then followed the river around and buried a lead plate overlooking the cities of Pierre and Fort Pierre on a hill over on the west side of the river, claiming this area for France. And this is why we purchased this area from France in the Louisiana Purchase, is because of this claiming. This was 1743. And they were looking for beavers and buffalo pelts and all kinds of things, but they, that was their initial thing, was to extract wealth directly from here. And so if you watch The Revenant, which actually took place in South Dakota where there are no trees, but that was a very real thing. The goal was always been, or has always been, to extract maximum amounts of wealth from the colonies, a European goal. At that time, the European empires, their goal was to extract this wealth, either North and South America, Australia, and New Zealand, from their colonies. And now it isn't the empire so much, but I think it still is. Perhaps the multinational companies play that role. In 1796, exchange of letters between Alexander Hamilton and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, they discussed the need to do a better job of managing the soils on the eastern seaboard, or they would be it would be necessary to move westward to find new land. And David Montgomery, the photo on the front of David Montgomery's book, Dirt, which is there in the corner, was actually taken in South Dakota. But anyway, they made this discussion in 1796. 7 years later, we bought the Louisiana Purchase. So they didn't try for very long. And here is where Lewis and Clark came through South Dakota. Dakota Lakes is about in the middle of that photo, right above the Big Bend. You can see the Big Bend, what they call the Big Bend, or the Big Meander, when Lewis and Clark came through. And this is where what their trip was, and they actually walked right across the banks of, right across our land on the southern part of our property on the northern bank of the Missouri River. So this is what I think it would have looked like, other than the river bottom would have been filled with big trees. This is just east of our pump station, and through a little bit of work on our part and a lot of work on Mother Nature's part, we have reestablished native vegetation, or what I think was a native vegetation there on that site. We've got the Maximilian sunflowers and the big and little blue stem and Indian grass and switchgrass and all those kind of nice things there, and lots of forbs. So this was 1804 when Lewis and Clark came through. Less than 50 years occurred between statehood and 1889, and we had basically almost no people here prior to 1889. So 50 years between 1889 and the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. It was less than 50 years. So it's amazing to me when I think about this, how fast we degraded the ecosystem here without having big plows and all those kind of things. We're doing this by overgrazing and cutting down the trees and the draws and doing some farming and those kind of things. At the same time the dust was blowing in the 1930s, the Missouri River was flooding. So that gives you a cause, because it caused a pause, because it was dry. The water cycle was totally broken. So what do? Well, we build large main stem reservoirs, and that's when this whole idea occurred, was in the 30s. was to build these 4 dams in South Dakota, one dam in North Dakota, one in Montana, 6 total on the Pick Sloan project. And they promised 500,000 acres of planned irrigation in the state. Now that was going to go over in that Redfield area where the James Valley Research Center was, and that was the irrigation farm associated with the Oahe project. This has not been all that long ago that this was still going. That's why I managed that farm, because it was still active, and that project was still planned when I graduated with my PhD. What they were doing is treating the symptom instead of addressing the problem. They should have put the beaver back or done something like that, but just to try to put these reservoirs in to stop the flooding, well, that was mainly to help St. Louis and Omaha and Kansas City and Sioux City. So here's the Pick Sloan dams. You can see way up at the top is Oahe, way down at the bottom is Big Bend. We're right there where that big meander. We're just to the northwest of that big meander area, what we call the pocket. So the plan was to take the water from the Missouri River by canal all the way to the James River Valley, because in the 1930s, you didn't have a center pivot. You had to irrigate with gravity, and you needed level land to do that. Now, between you and me, if we would have put that irrigation in the James River Valley, it would have been a mess. It would be totally degraded by now. That wasn't a popular thing to say in the 1980s. Now, in the 1970s, with high grain prices, low interest rates, and the invention of a electrical powered center pivot, farmers started to develop irrigation along the Missouri River on their own, along these reservoirs. And they promptly pumped the water up the hill, irrigated with it, and it promptly ran back down the hill. And as you can see here, it's a huge problem with runoff. And this is about when we entered the fray, because I was working in the Gettysburg area for a fertilizer dealer. And that got me started back into agriculture. I was actually a chemistry teacher. The water cycle was still broken. So putting water on the land was treating the symptom, wasn't really addressing the problem that they had there. And Dakota Lakes farmed as a result of some of the work we were doing with making water go in the ground better. And farmers, we had a field day, and the farmers got together at a bar, and they decided to farm an organization to run a research farm in the central part of the state, predominantly focused on irrigation, which we changed that fairly quickly into a more wide, little broader scope. But it's owned by farmers, irrigated dry land, all low disturbance stuff, because I had gotten far enough at Redfield on that lacustrine lake plain to know that we needed. I got a slide here. It's got some sound on it, so I'll let it finish. So we started at Redfield, and we brought that technology out here with us, and we never have done tillage here. And we can put 2 inches of water on in 9 minutes without runoff. So the area impacted by Dakota Lakes Research Farm is between those two black lines. It's central, north central, and south central crop reporting districts in South Dakota. Redfield's on the right. Dakota Lakes is on the left. We in 2015 met with the Board of Regents. We discussed what impact we'd had here. And we compared corn, soybean, spring wheat, and winter wheat and sunflower production in these 3 regions in 2014 as compared to 1986, before anybody was doing no-till other than me and 1 or 2 other guys. The difference in crop production based on the price August 12, 2015 at Woolsey was $1.6 billion a year. Now, that is pretty substantial. This success at Dakota Lakes Research Farm was not achieved because we set out to improve yields. We really weren't trying to do that. We were trying to get the water to go in the ground, because you can't get the water to go in the ground if you got the dirt blowing, if you got all these things happening in the country. They would close the highway between Oneida and Pierre, or Gettysburg and Pierre, because of blowing dirt. if that's happening, you really don't have much of a chance of getting yields to go up because your water cycle isn't working. I like to use this saying, it's not mine, but the light bulb was not invented by incrementally making candles better. One of the things we do in ag research is we do a lot of incremental work. I'm going to make my corn yields just slightly better if I put on this herbicide or this fungicide or use this variety, but we're really not rethinking the whole program. So most agricultural research and agriculture policies have been directed at trying doing the wrong thing better. So we take this thing where we're exporting stuff across the water and lots of inputs and lots of outputs, and we continue to try to improve that system instead of maybe questioning why we're doing that. I think it needs on a global scale, government scale, as well as the farmers themselves, it needs to be directed to helping the society do the correct things as well as possible. Because one of the things that happens as you export all your products and whatever, you also export your children. And if we had more cyclic systems here, we would be exporting less children, could be things for them to do. In Argentina, this has taken the form of the children not just leaving the countryside and going to the cities like they do here, they actually leave the country and go somewhere else. So on what we really try to do and we talk about all the time is to work on ecosystem process level. How is our water cycle working? How is the energy flow working? How does that compare to what it was in natural systems, the mineral cycle, and the community dynamics, meaning the diversity and how species flow around here. Does rain feed plants and recharge groundwater, or does it run off or deep percolate and cause erosion or water quality degradation? What happens to our rainfall? Almost all the existing and planned irrigation in central South Dakota, including the Wahi project over there around Redfield, didn't happen. And the guys that had developed here, all of them with lifts over about 200 feet or 250 feet, have transitioned back to rain-fed management. It makes no sense. We were, by putting irrigation there, and they had planned irrigation all the way from Pierre to Redfield. Putting irrigation there, we're spending a lot of money, a lot of capital, and we're going to have degradation, and we needed really to rethink about whether that was the right thing to do. It's more profitable and more environmentally friendly to do what we're doing right now. Installing drainage tile has allowed farmers in some areas to do a better job of growing corn and soybean in rotation. I don't doubt that. It's made that easier to do, but maybe doing the right thing would involve utilizing diverse rotations that included perennial sequences. And there's a lot of policy things and government things and industry things that favor doing this wrong thing instead of doing the right thing for the land. If lakes and rivers appear where they never were found before, it means the water cycle, water is not being used to maximum benefit. That water that's causing this problem that we drain away could be used to make carbon and sequester carbon and whatever. We could utilize that, especially in South Dakota. We're not that wet. In Argentina, they now have rivers forming where they never were before. And that's very sad. No-till is not about lack of tillage. And everybody said, well, you started no-till. Well, we do no-till because it's a tool that we need to manage the ecosystem. And it's not about lack of tillage, but about being able to manage the soil, water, soil structures, soil biology, and carbon compounds in the soil. And if you do tillage, you can't do any of those things. It's totally out of your control. It's like a large catastrophic event. So we keep the armor on our soil. We have lots of macropores where the water goes in and it goes away from the surface so it doesn't get slimy. One of the best, funnest things we do in the summer when we irrigate with 2 inches in 9 minutes, we will walk people behind the irrigators and you won't get your feet wet. You won't get them muddy. And that's because the water is going away from the surface you have aeration yet, so you don't get waterlogging. It's a totally different system. If you're familiar with irrigation, you know that wheel tracks can be a problem. This is about 20 years of wheel tracks. So there's just not a big issue with real wheel tracks here unless we have something break and a wheel spins because we have a shaft break or something like that. Take the E out of ET, we want to make the water go through the plants. So we don't want to use evaporation at all. We want it to go through a plant because when it goes through the plant, it makes us money, make the water enter the soil and maximize the water holding capacity in the soil. And one of the reasons we have a lot of problems in some areas is because our organic matter now has gotten so low that our water holding capacity is decreased significantly from when grandfather and maybe your fathers, or most likely your grandfathers and great grandfathers came here and homesteaded. So we've changed it. We've got a smaller bucket, which means it gets drier faster and wetter faster. I noticed they just came out with a thing yesterday on the impacts of tillage erosion in Iowa. It's pretty sobering. Ecosystems harvest sunlight energy to drive all other processes. So you should judge yourself by how efficiently you harvest sunlight. Not if you grow just corn and soybeans, you're only harvesting about half or less of the sunlight that falls on your land. Make maximum use of the sunlight to convert water into biological energy because that's what drives everything. Removing products from the ecosystem reduces the energy available for the biology to operate. So everybody still wants to take residue from the systems and make it into power or something like that. And that is not going to be a thing that's long-term sustainable. Is the energy used constant or finite? Well, the sunlight that falls on the land that you farm is constant. It's going to happen. It's going to be there every day. The stuff you buy is finite, the fossil fuels, and sooner or later they run out. Is it benign or potentially damaging? Well, sunlight, unless you're a fair-skinned Caucasian that doesn't wear sunscreen or covering, you can get some cancer, but other than that, sunlight is benign. Fossil fuels are potentially damaging, both when they're harvested, when they're transported, and when they're used. Sunlight is internal. It's free. The fossil fuels and those kind of things are external. You have to buy them. I was thinking this morning, if we had better policy, we could have solar panels all over here, either for shade for cattle or whatever. We could have solar panels and sell that energy back into the grid. Unfortunately, the people who run the power companies do not want you to do that. So as farmers, we should be able to do those kind of things and even help to supply the power grid. But what we need is not pipelines, it's power lines that may help us distribute our local energy around better. 80% of the total input costs in agriculture can be traced directly to energy at the present time, other than land costs. 1970, the average wheat price was $1.37 a bushel, and the average price of barrel oil was $3.39. Well, wheat price today is probably, I haven't looked, but it's on the north side is $6. It's as good as it's ever been, probably because of the freeze in the south. Crude oil is over 50. So that's not a winning ratio. It takes the energy of 1 gallon of diesel fuel to manufacture, transport, and apply 5 pounds of N. Your big elephant you sleep with in terms of energy is nitrogen. 150 pounds of N is equivalent to 30 gallons of diesel fuel in terms of energy. Fossil fuel input in agriculture 120 years ago was essentially zero, and 120 years ago it has to be zero again. You know, it probably is time that we start thinking about this, and that's one of the things we've done for a while. The Dakota Lakes Research Farm will be fossil fuel neutral by 2026. And we have a board of directors that allows us to take these kind of long-term looks at things and attempts at things, and we find out what kind of problems we run into. This is kind of how we did no-till, is we just decided we were going to no-till, and then you have all these problems to solve. It's a weak link approach thing. One of the things we do is we do press our own oil seeds, all of our soybeans, canola, flax, those type of crops. We press the oil out of them, and we get a meal that's about 45% or 40 to 45% protein, and we feed that to our livestock. The oil we could use for direct burning, or we can sell and then use that as a net trade-off for buying fossil fuels. We'd like to have a straight vegetable oil tractor, but we can't get those here. You can buy them in Germany, but they won't let us bring one in. This includes producing enough energy to replace all energy associated with production and transportation of the crop, including making our new machines. If we buy a machine, it takes a lot of energy to get it here. This will be done without mining the soil of nutrients, organic matter, and productivity, or adversely impacting the environment. That's a big challenge, but that's what we're going to have to do. And we do this, we're trying to address the problem. The problem is too much energy use, too much export and import of stuff. So we're trying to address the problem instead of treating the symptoms. I think back to when we put terraces in, and this is a photo I actually took out of an airplane of terraces in an irrigated field where the water would be running like crazy. Well, the terrace didn't really help the water go in the ground. They just kind of kept it from cutting a gully in the field. Soil degradation is a symptom. It's a symptom, not a problem. It's a symptom of indifference, ignorance, greed, and hubris. That's the cause. Tillage is just one of the tools. I've learned more from observing nature than by trying to change it. Mother Nature has been managing ecosystems better and for longer than anyone else. And that's one of the things I've marveled at, is we don't just look at, we needed to have looked at how Mother Nature was managing things when we came here. And we probably should have been paying closer attention to the Native American farmers who were here shortly before we got here. They were pretty much all dead and gone by the time we got here. What does Mother Nature do? She harvests the maximum amount of sunlight. She leaks very few nutrients, including carbon dioxide, from the system. We've been going down in organic matter no matter what we do in farming. Now people say, well, I built my organic matter up, doing great. Well, you're not up to where it was, but when it was native vegetation. And it's very, very hard to get there. She makes maximum use of water and other nutrients because she doesn't leak them out by having webs of mycorrhizal fungi and other tricks. And she uses animals, big ones and little ones, as part of the system. And I think we're all starting to realize how important the microorganisms are. And those really don't do well if you've done tillage. Are the nutrients available for plant use and environmental services, or have they been leached, eroded, or transported from the landscape, sent to China or the ocean or the Mississippi River or the Great Lakes, or one of the lakes in the state of South Dakota? So where have your nutrients gone if they're going away? Ecosystems that leak nutrients turn into deserts. And that's what a definition of desertification is loss of nutrients, including organic matter, carbon. A 120-car train of canola or soybeans contains 450,000 pounds of phosphate. So we all love these track loaders. There's a whole bunch of them out here along that rail coming out, and they load a 120-car train the way it goes. And they take all of our nutrients away, and it either goes closer to the ocean in the US or it goes to a foreign country. I asked this question, what was the crow rate's impact on Canadian prairie agriculture? And you don't know what that is, but the Canadian government developed a program of subsidizing transportation of grain from the east side of the Rocky Mountains in the prairies over the mountains to the West Coast in Vancouver. And they put a subsidy in there because, or they made the railroads put a subsidy in there because the Canadian government paid for building the pass, the tunnels and stuff through the Crow's Nest Pass. So that's where that crow rate comes from. The net effect was it destroyed the livestock industry because grain became higher price there because it was cheaper to ship to the port, and all the nutrients were going away as well. So they quit doing that. They figured it out. But at the time I met Ruth, and she was a Canadian county agent type person, she was in charge of putting out crow rate payments. Even if it doesn't totally leave, if it goes to a saline seep, it's in the wrong place. So if you don't manage your water and nutrient cycle properly, you have it moving, and then that saline seep becomes a problem, and the thing in that saline seep is fertilizer. So when we have students come from either Watertown or SDSU, we ask them what's in a saline seep. If they say salt, they get in trouble because it's actually fertilizer. A reduction in pH, organic matter, and fertility are symptoms of poor nutrient and water cycle management. And we get a lot of this pH question, and it's because we don't have perennial sequences in the rotation. So go out and take a soil sample from a CRP field and see what the pH is there. And it'll be quite a bit different than it is in the field right next to it. Weeds and diseases are nature's way of adding diversity to a system which lacks diversity. And our biggest fear when we started is that we would not be able to control weeds and diseases and insects. And it's one of the least problems we have right now. We have not used a broadcast insecticide at Dakota Lakes. This, I think, will be the 18th year. Nature's efforts to add diversity can be countered by adding beneficial diversity of our own to the system. We need at least three crop types. Long intervals of 2 to 4 years are needed to break some disease and weed cycles. And I think we need to have perennial sequences eventually to fix this thing right. Right now, we're just slowed the bleeding a bit in terms of what's going wrong by having no-till and some rotations, but without perennials, we haven't really fixed the system. This is Randy Anderson's work, but it's on some of our rotation studies years ago. He looked at tillage impact on weed seed in the soil, took green foxtail, if it was no-till left on the surface, or if he tilled it in shallow, something like a vertical tillage machine. And then looked at the number of weeds for 3 years. Well, if we no-tilled it, there's less weeds from the beginning because they tend not to grow well left on the surface. If you do a little bit of tillage, then they grow the best. And if you bury them, they go there and stay dormant. And then the next time you dig them up, then they go through this process. So 20 versus 50% grew the first year, 31 versus 4. So we get 96% weed control after a 2-year break, and a 3-year break gives you 97%. Long-term rotation study, cool and warm season crops, no-till herbicides, weed control, weed density after 12 years. If this is a wheat fallow, 31%, 31 plants per square meter or square yard, 53 where we did wheat chickpea, 13 where we had a wheat corn chickpea. So think of that wheat chickpea as a corn soybean. Wheat corn chickpea 13, and corn soybean wheat spring wheat, winter wheat spring wheat, corn soybean 3%. Does this action that you're doing address the weakest point in the life cycle of the organism, weed or insect problems? When are they most vulnerable? Well, before they start to grow, or before they set seed, or before they get into the field. This sanitation and type idea of not letting weed seeds into the field. If they get in and get established, like these kochia plants, this is a photo from way back in the early 90s when people said that weeds would not be resistant to pursuit. Well, here's a kochia weed that proves otherwise. And the most worst time to treat a weed is once it's up and growing. It's like a teenager then, it's harder to kill. Doing the wrong thing better in this case would be to look for tank mixes or something to improve post-emerge kochia weed control. And that's a way we approach our thing with corn soybeans when we get resistant weeds. Doing the right thing involves using more diverse rotations and then going to some soil applied weed control practices and those kind of things to get a little bit more less predictable, take the pressure off. And there's there's a presentation that I made for the South Dakota No-Till Association. If you go to the SD No-Till website, there's a good rotational presentation made that covers a lot of weed control and insect things and whatever. There are diseases that really need 6 years of break, okay? But the big thing that we have focused on actually to make things better for us is to make sure we're adding organic matter. A small amount of organic matter by weight has a big impact on pore space because it's so fluffy. It weighs as 1/5 as much as the same volume of soil. Think of a sidewalk around a house that's been newly constructed. The land where the lawn is going to be planted is always several inches below the top level of the sidewalk, usually 6 or 7. And when you come back in a few years and they've been a lawn there maybe for 7 years or so, the lawn itself now is fluffed the soil up to the point where the lawn is actually higher than the sidewalk. So that's the kind of thing that needs to happen on our lands. Within all texture groups, as organic matter increased from 1 to 3%, the available water holding capacity doubled. And what you've done is take soils that probably were 6 or 5 or 3, whatever you started with, and you've taken them down to the 1. In the case here, we had a lot of stuff that was 1% when we started, and that didn't get cured right away because it takes time to build that organic matter. When organic matter content increased to 4%, they account for more than 60% of the available water holding capacity. So this is a huge thing. And if you look at old journals, when people first homesteaded, they were way more productive with what they had to work with than we are now. Where I really noticed this in spades was in Argentina. This is a photo I took in 1996. And they were doing 7 years of pastures and 7 years of cropping was a typical system for them. They used very little fertilizer, needed very little fertilizer in their farming operations. They used diverse rotations when they were in the farming phase. They had corn, wheat, soybeans, sorghum, and they also did a lot of cover crops. On the left side here is black oats and hairy vetch. It's been killed. I think it's just black oats without hairy vetch. It was been killed to go to soybeans after corn. And I had a person you guys probably all know, Ron Alverson. He was much better looking in those days. Can't even see who it is, but anyway, we took and held up a soil sample there, and this was 1996. And if you want an epitome of a healthy soil, that's what it looks like. And you try to define healthy soil, and it's hard to define, but we all know one when we see one, and that is one. And that big earthworm hanging out, it was wonderful. Then they outlawed the export of beef, and that was a big thing for them because there's not enough people in Argentina to eat as much beef as they could produce. And they outlawed the export of beef, and everybody went to producing almost continuous soybeans with occasionally a corn crop. And we went back, or I went back to that same field in 2006, 10 years later. And that's what it looked like. And this is what a lot of soils in South Dakota look like now too, or it did look like 5 or 10 years ago. And it doesn't take very long for it to degrade. When my daughters were small, they're all big girls now and all have jobs and they're doing great. We went to the Museum of Man and Nature in Winnipeg, and they have a monolith of a prairie plant with its root systems. This is what we try to emulate with our chintzy little corn and soybean roots. We're not even close. And it's all about the roots and all about carbon going into the soil through the roots in terms of building organic matter. Organic matter makes a difference. This is kind of the first 15, 16 years of being at Dakota Lakes. We started in 1990. We have 3 rotations that we started at that time. These 2 rotations that we have here are the same in terms of the 2 years before wheat. They're corn and then peas and then winter wheat. In both cases, the difference is the bottom one of the 2 has an extra soybean in there. So it's 50% low residue crop, soybean and pea being low residue, wheat and corn being high residue, versus 66% high residue. And we didn't notice this for about the first 10 years. And in 2002, we had a really dry year and 6 inches of rain from the time we harvested peas until we harvested the wheat. And the difference in yield was 56 versus 28 bushel. And that happened also in 2006 when we had 7.9 inches. And it happened in 2005 when we had a wet year that was 23 inches in that 12 months, which is more than our 17 to 18 that we're used to. There's a difference there. You won't notice it exactly the first few years. Now that poor rotation still performed better than a wheat fallow or whatever they were doing before, but it's not as good as it could be if we raise the organic matter. We've now taken that bottom rotation and we make it look exactly like that top rotation, corn, pea, winter wheat. But we put a 5-year perennial sequence in there every 15 years. So in a 20-year cycle, we'll have 15 years of cropping and we'll have 5 years of perennial grass. And we'll see how if that's enough or not. Argentines are using 7 and 7. This is what the wheat looked like in the low residue rotation in 2006. This is what it looked like right across the road, basically, in the high residue rotation. Here it is on an aerial photo, and there's just a huge difference in the false infrared image. We also see this under irrigation where we do a rotation that's corn, corn, soybean, wheat, soybean. Instead of doing corn, bean, we start out with quite a bit of corn, bean stuff here. We only have one of those left because it just kind of destroys the soil. But here we do a little bit more diversity in terms of sequence and interval, corn, corn, soybean, wheat, soybean. And first year soybeans in this case is 76. The second year after that cover crop that follows the wheat, 81.2. If we do corn, soybeans, it's 62.9 on average versus 78.8 average on that more diverse rotation. So corn, if we do continuous corn, which we have a field that's been corn since 1990, longer than the students come here, it's longer than they've been alive, which really blows their minds. And 203 bushels would be a long-term average on that. Corn, soybean, 217, and then this corn, corn, soybean, wheat, soybeans is 235 on average, and it's creeping above that now. But the first year corn after that 3-year break is the best, of course. We can figure that out. And the second year is a little bit like the corn soybean thing in terms of the way it yields. So what does that mean? People say I can't afford not to grow corn and soybeans. Well, I think you can. If you did continuous corn with 5,000 acres doing that rotation, you have 1 million bushels of corn. If you did corn and soybean, now you got 2,500 acres of corn and 2,500 acres of soybeans. You got a little over 500,000 bushels of corn and 157,000 bushels of soybeans and no wheat. And if you do the corn, corn, soybean, wheat, soybean, you have 470,000 bushels of corn, 157,000. Notice that we have more total beans produced on 2,000 acres here than on corn, soybean, where it's 2,500 acres. And then you get the 120,000 bushels of wheat for free. If you put economics to that, does it make sense to trade 72,500 bushels of corn for 120,000 bushels of wheat and 350 bushels of soybean? Well, that's not too hard. And even today where the wheat yields and corn yields and bean yields or prices are higher than they've been in a while. Right before 9/11, we had one of our board members brought his brother who was doing a missionary thing in Afghanistan, came to the farm, and they were wondering about doing no-till in Afghanistan, and we thought they should give it a try and whatever, and we talked to them, and they got a drill, and they got it through Russia and into Afghanistan, which was an interesting trick. And he sent me these pictures, and he said it's not working very well. Excuse me. Well, what's missing there? The residue. And you wonder where the residue went. Well, Abdul took it and he dug it up actually by the roots, and he loaded it on his semis or his straight truck and took it to the buildings. The difference between there and here is they've been doing this for longer. And so that in the background is the Hindu Kush that used to be all big forests. And number two, their equipment is smaller. We have the capability to do this much, much faster. We have only been here in this part of South Dakota a little over 100 years, maybe 120. What is the long-term impact of hay export from the Intermountain West? I had a young man that came from Utah this summer to visit. He does 7 years of alfalfa that's shipped to Japan. He then does 2 years of corn that he sells to a local feedlot in Utah, but doesn't get any manure back. And then he goes to another 7 years of alfalfa. Well, if we do that very long, there won't be anything left there. And he was trying to do a cover crop. He thought maybe he did a cover crop between his two corns, it would help him. Yeah, I was kind of going, well, okay, but it's not going to help enough. What does Mother Nature do? She makes maximum use of water and nutrients. She uses animals. In dry or brittle environments, soil biology slows during times of low soil moisture. The rumen of grazing animals remains moist, keeps the biology going. In cold climates, soil biology slows during times of low soil temperatures. The rumen of grazing animals remains warm during times of cold, and the biological processes continue. And I think if my video is on, you see the pivot behind us. That's how we do things. So now in the irrigated portion of the farm where we have enough moisture, when we grow the wheat, we'll also grow a cover crop following the wheat. This is oats and barley and those kind of things that we put in there. And then we will swath those in the fall, right before frost. When they're good hay thing, we'll leave them out there during the winter. It keeps really good condition. It's easy for the cows to find when it's really snowy. And that's our winter feed. And we use the irrigators to move our wires. And so that's how we do things. They eat the corn stalks, they eat the leaves and things in the cornfield as well. So they get the high quality feed from the swaths. And you notice that the armor is still on the soil because the stripper headed wheat straw just lays down and it creates a uniform armor on the field. And then the cows eat the swaths and distribute their manure. The only way to produce human edible protein in marginal land is to use a ruminant animal. You can't do fake meat and stuff, grow veggies and low residue crops up on those hills. We got to have a cow do that stuff for us, or a goat or a sheep. There's more goat meat eaten in the world than there is beef. Agriculture cannot do this alone. I'm not being negative to agriculture. I think it's society and it's the government that have to learn to think about things differently and expect, help us to do, get us policies and procedures that help us do these things right. Ecosystem degradation, like I said, is a symptom. Bureaucracies, governments, and corporations are operated by people with limited tenure and short-term goals. I mean, they really don't care about 200 years or 100 years from now. And as farmers and small town people, we need to be thinking longer term, 100, 200, 300 years. What's it going to be like here? What would we like it to be like here? Would we like it to be totally abandoned? Society, landowners, farmers deserve to have long-term research and development objectives. Now, if we do all grant-funded research, it's going to be 3-year stuff. And that's a problem we have right now. The climate will change. I guess we haven't totally quit arguing about that, but it's going to change, but it'll still be a continental climate here. We'll still have cold winters and hot, dry summers. How cold and how hot, we're not sure. But the degradation of the ecosystem we've already done and could potentially do has more potential impact. We're much more resilient if we can get our systems organized better. Farmers and ranchers harvest sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water to produce products we can sell. Some of this is human food. We need to be aware of the nutrition issues and offsite impacts. If you want to eat beef, maybe we should concentrate on producing beef instead of corn and barley that feeds beef in feedlots. Doing the right thing environmentally is almost always the correct economic approach in the long run. The best time to make transformational change like this was 600 years ago, before we ever started in here. If we could have come in with a different mindset. The second best time is now. We may not get another chance. So take the E out of ET and take the T out of can't. So thank you for listening to my tirade this morning. I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you,
Hello.
Dwayne, for a wonderful presentation. I don't see any question in our Q&A or the chat box, but please feel free to type any questions, any comment, anything you have out there, so that we can discuss.
I can't believe I didn't cause some controversy. Some of that history stuff is really interesting when you live here where there were farming tribes in this area long ago, long before a white man showed up.
There's one question, Dwayne. What do you see as the biggest obstacle currently to doing the right thing?
Well, the reward is to sell something that gets exported, first of all, and I don't know how we get the government to think that maybe isn't a great thing. I think some of the restrictions on how we do perennials would really be helpful for us to be encouraged to put more perennials in, and not as a CRP that is a 10-year thing, but as something that's a normal part of a integrated livestock system. The large feedlots have an advantage if you think about it as an industrial system of producing meat. I mean, they have an advantage because they just handle so many animals at one time. But it's very hard for them, if you look at the nutrient cycles and stuff, it's very hard for them to get the nutrients back to where it came from. And an example of that is in Canada, around that area between Calgary and Medicine Hat, along the #1 highway. If you've ever been there, there's just a big raft of feedlots in that area. And so grain comes from all over Canada into that feedlot area, and they produce tons of meat there, and there's processing there and whatever, but their phosphorus tests are so high that the fields are almost toxic waste dumps. They just have no place to put all that phosphorus because it's all been concentrated in that one zone, probably 150 miles long.
There are a few more questions that just popped on. I'm going to read out the first one to you.
Okay.
Any insights on your phosphate studies?
Yeah, and if you go on our virtual field day link, we have a fairly lengthy thing there. I'm convinced that we can run soil test Ps if we're long-term no-till type stuff, we can run soil test Ps very low without hurting our yields, as long as we're probably placing, at least in our situation, we get down where we're less than 5 parts per million Olsen. And as long as we are placing a little bit of phosphorus type material in proximity to the seed, not necessarily on the seed, but close, we see no yield response there at all. And we do, it's going to be interesting. We got 2 more years at least left on that, and we're coming into corn this year, so that should be the acid test. we had a wheat year in there, of course, and the wheat year we showed a definite advantage to placing some phosphorus. I also have a companion study in there where we're looking at placement versus broadcast, and there's definitely an advantage to placement on wheat.
Another one I have here is, in your 5-year rotation, corn, soy, wheat, soy, how much added fertility does it take to get the high yields presently right now?
Well, we don't fertilize any differently than what we have forever. I think my PhD work was the first place we started to calibrate for those higher yields, and we found out that it was more efficient nitrogen use per unit of production as you went higher in yields, not lower. That was different than what they used to think. But we use a nitrate test because I don't think it's easy for us to predict how much mineralization is going to take place. So we use a nitrate test just like we normally would, and we use a total N, nitrate plus fertilizer N. We use about 0.9 to 1 pound of N per bushel. And so that's not different from what other people are doing. And then if we're wrong, because we live out here and we don't have a lot of rainfall, we pick it up in the next year's nitrate test. So we take a full 3-foot nitrate test on irrigated ground.
Another question is also relates to the same rotation that you just mentioned. What is the management between the corn years? Is it grazed stalks with covers? How well does the no-till corn and corn planting operation work?
Well, we don't do much cover between the corn because we don't have time. We do graze the stalks at that time, which does add some diversity. Actually, there's quite a bit of biology goes in there with the cows. Planting corn on corn for us is relatively easy. We're in 20-inch rows, which you would think would make it more difficult, but because of our system, it's pretty easy, either 20 or 30s. It doesn't make that much difference. We run a fertilizer opener on our corn planter, and we place, that's probably the biggest trick on fertility, is to place that fertilizer. We do it 3 inches to the side and the same depth as the seed. And that cuts the residue, and then we can smudge the stuff across a little bit. Now we move very little residue, but we do move just a little bit in those corns on corns just to make sure there isn't a big bunch of something there. The trick to it is to leave the corn stalks absolutely as long as you can and as intact. And if you're doing tillage, you want them all chopped up into little tiny pieces so you can get through them with a tillage machine. So I've known Marion Calmer, the Calmer cornheads. I've known him forever, for probably almost 30 years. And the last time I saw him, he wanted to give me his new magic chopping heads. And I'm going, no, Marion, I don't want to chop it up. I want an old worn up stripping roll. And that's the same thing with wheat. We will use a stripper head in wheat. We keep the residue really long, and it's much more manageable that way.
Another question I have here is relates to cover crops after wheat. What products are you using for the cover crops after wheat? And there's multiple parts of this question. That's the first part. And do you plant different cover crops in a dry year than in a wet year? How do you manage cover crops differently in a dry year versus a wet year?
Well, the first thing is knowing if you're in a dry year or a wet year. We don't do a lot of, if I have a dry year where it's dry at wheat harvest, we normally won't seed cover crop in our dry land. Up north, we're more likely to, because the soils are much more shallow up there, so they don't hold any water anyway. But on the irrigated, the what we plant depends on what's going to be seeded the next year, and the same would be true on the dry land. If we have a wet year and we think it's going to remain wet and we have quite a bit of moisture at harvest time, then we will seed right behind the combines. And I have a graduate student that's just finishing his PhD or his master's. He'll be done this spring. Sam Ireland, and he was using a drone to try to figure out what the crop coefficient of the cover crops were, and then he was terminating at different dates and trying to figure out if you could use that as a way to know when to terminate a cover crop. You have to plant right away. If there's any chance that you're going to need it, you have to plant right away behind the combine. You can't wait because you won't have enough moisture and you don't get enough sunlight. So you got to get as close as you can to the combine. And then you make a decision whether to terminate it or not, or let it grow. And so we also had Matt Hansen about 10 years ago, did a lot of work with cover crops, but you can hurt your yield the next year because you took too much moisture or you took too much nitrogen. But it's more of an art than a science. But on the irrigated ground, water isn't an issue. So then, and we're usually finishing relatively high in moisture there anyway. So we'll plant the cover crops, and we don't get enough rain to maintain them. We can throw a little water on with the irrigators going by, but we don't have to worry about it the next year because we can fill it back up. I should say in eastern South Dakota, I would just behind small grains. If you look at the long-term rainfall patterns, you should be planting something right away, because most of the time, almost all times, you'll need that.
And there's one more question, Dwayne, but I'm trying to show my QR code right now, so I need to pull up my other screen here and then read out that to you. Can the way you think of meat production on marginal land overcome the arguments for moving to a fake meat food system where meat is lab produced and all the distasteful things of animal ag are eliminated? The list of ingredients in fake meat does not seem like an improvement in our diet. How can this become a better way of eating?
Well, I don't think it is, and I think there's some people that don't want to be convinced of that. The thing we're actively trying to do here, and Cody Zilverberg's involved in that, is we have the cows and the calves, and then we want to keep the calves with the herd. Most of the time we may have to separate them when we wean them, but basically keep the herd together. We have some self feeding type, some stalls that will feed each individual their own diet, so we can have every animal get an individual diet, and those will travel around with the herd, and we're in the process of getting that developed right now. And then that calf can stay in that herd with his family until it's time to be harvested for meat. And what Gabe Brown says, and I'll steal it, that they've had a really great life and one really bad day, but that's way better than what we've been doing with them. And I think we can sell that to the consumer. I don't think, like I said, I don't think we can feed the world all on plants. I just don't think it's not really doable. And humans, not very many years ago, they ate predominantly meat and a little bit of other stuff, but mostly it was meat, because that encompasses being able to harvest a whole bunch of plants, a high diversity of plants that we can't grow all those.
Yeah, that takes care of all the questions I had at this point. And there's a poll that just showed up on our screen. And after this, we'll convert everybody that's attending right now to panelists so that they can also, unmute their mic if they want to, or show their face, or open their video, and then we'll have a informal discussion after we get done with this poll. And there is a chat in the question. Just popped on. Okay. When transitioning from tillage to no-till, do you have a preferred crop to start with to make the transition easier?
Oh, I think that depends on what you're starting with. We've had several occasions when we took a perennial grass and transitioned it into no-till crop production. And in that case, we'll almost always use a pea or a soybean, something like that, that's large seeded and go into that heavy residue and come out, and they're not bothered by that lack of nitrogen you'll have in a soddy type situation where there's not a lot of free nitrogen there unless you do tillage. The exception to that is this year we actually have some wheat growing in some switchgrass that we killed, so we'll see how that works. And then in the old days, what we would start with, like at Redfield, when we first started doing this, we would, if we were doing tillage the last year, we might incorporate something like a Treflan or a Prowl type thing and plant a broadleaf soybean or sunflower, and then we would go with 2 wheats. And so that would really clean up a lot of weeds, because the Treflan or Prowl thing in that broadleaf crop lets you really clean up the grasses, and you come in with the 2 cereals and you build residue real fast, and you can really whack away on broadleaf weeds and the perennials that might be there. And then you're into your first corn type thing after the wheat. I mean, that we used to do that kind of thing, but it's really a bit of a chess game, and it's no different than any other crop rotation. And I don't think I've never felt that by transitioning to no-till that we had a lag in terms of productivity. Always had better productivity than if we would have done tillage. But the big difference is the rotation thing. If you transition to no-till and don't really change your rotation, you've really limited yourself. I used to ask people the question, like, if you had a dryland field and you put an irrigator on, would you use the same rotation? And they just look at me stupid, like, no, you wouldn't do that. And I'm going, so why are you doing that with no-till? I mean, it's the same thought process. You have to change your approach to things. You got more water, you got to use it, or it's going to become troublesome.
I must have missed another question that was earlier than the last one. So what is your ideal crop rotation for a long-term no-till?
I had a young guy ask me that question one time, and I noticed that he'd just gotten married, and because he still had his wedding ring on, which most farmers, they learn pretty fast that needs to stay someplace else in the beginning. Don't not get your finger caught. And so I asked him who chose his wife, and he said, well, I did. See, so now you got to choose your own rotation, and if you look through that rotation thing that's on the no-till website that Ruth put up there, it depends, and it may depend on who your landlord is or how far it is from your farmstead. For instance, you can't do some things that are 20 miles away that you could do that's just across the road. And so soil type makes a big difference, and its past history makes a difference. The one thing I think we have learned, that if we're less than 75% high residue crops and don't have a perennial sequence in there, then we're losing carbon. So we think we need to be, at least 75% high residue crops. And we'll, in that virtual field day, we'll have some of that in there. You'll see the differences in the soil. So that's the one that's a struggle for people, because they perceive they're making money on the soybeans and the sunflowers and such, but you quickly start degrading and getting the disease issues. So again, I'd encourage you to go through that rotation presentation. And then also we've got a thing called agroecosystem management, which talks about the same things, the crop rotations that we have on our website. And it's a personal thing. You could do a perennial sequence and then come in and do something really stupid for about 6 years and then a perennial sequence. And that's kind of what they did in Argentina, where they had that 7 years of pastures and 7 years of cropping. And it kind of like hitting the restart button. So everybody's going to have a different personality there, but it surely helps when you have livestock because you have a lot wider range of things you can do.